Uh, Okay, I think we should start. I think that's fine. So, what we're gonna do today, uh, really as a preparation for your great tutorial on Friday with Christiane, who appeared, we're gonna go through network approaches. And the goal is that we are going to be, first of all, introducing why we're tackling networks and see how we've already seen some implicit or explicit ideas that require a network approach when we discuss teamwork and when we discuss science. And then we're going to go through the basics of how do we build and analyze networks? What are the tools that we need to think through? And Christiana was just telling me that I always have so many books to recommend. They just come out of me. But so there's three books that I think are actually quite good to talk about networks in a non-pop science way. A first course in network science by Fortunato and Al is a first course. It's very introductive and it's very, oh, you got a bunch of data from Facebook. How do you analyze it? There's the network science book by Barabaji, which is instead a very different kind of book. It's a physics-like book that starts with the idea of what is a network and how do we generate a network. We cannot really understand networks unless we understand the mechanisms that allow the network to have the structure it has. And it's also online. It's very easy to read. There's a few equations, but you don't need to be scared by that. And the third book, if you want to go more in depth, is somebody coming from a completely different perspective. It's called Network Psychometrics with R, and it's written by a bunch of quantitative psychologists in Amsterdam, mostly, at least that's where they were working when they wrote that book, which is about how can we use the ideas of network to rethink cognitive and psychological phenomena, and how do we then do robust statistics on that? So there's three very complementary approaches, but they're all very useful to think through, and there's lots of the ideas in those books are actually filtering through what we're going to do today and on Friday. Oh, I forgot one. And this is actually one of my favorite books. That's because as I started working more and more with psychologists, I started getting very skeptical about human intuitions about humans. And a way of getting out of that is to actually look at people who work on animals, non-human animals, because their reviewers and your peers will crucify you if you say, anything like, oh, these two animals are interleaving their vocalizations, therefore they're taking turns. No, you really need to design a formal model that could generate that mechanism, that behavior, and then show that the behavior is more likely to be generated by that model than by a bunch of null models around. And this book is a really nice collection of how we can use this network approach to actually rethink foundational biological and cognitive phenomena, so that it's not just a property of the individual. Individuals that are bigger or have bigger, I don't know, upper arms, as some political scientists investigate, do these and that, and therefore they get power. It's actually about how, even in non-human animals, the way in which you situated in a network actually has a causal effect on your ability to do cognition, to, if you're an ecologist or a biologist, you always look at procreation, at foraging, and so on and so forth. More endless books. This is something that a few years ago, I'm not going to go through them, but a few years ago, there was a boom of pop science books on how we should use networks to rethink everything. And these are just the four that really made it big, just as a historical reference. But what is a network, right? The idea behind network approaches is kind of a Copernican revolution in the sense that it says usually people are very concerned about essences, like the ontology, the properties of the individual, right? So they would look at this and say, you know, these two entities, whatever they are clearly different, right? One is a square, one is a, I don't know if you can see it, but one is a circle. And what the network approach does is actually the property of the individuals, what those units do, right? Their role in whatever analysis we're going to do, and we're going to make examples, really doesn't depend by anything that's intrinsic to the unit. It depends on the relations that these units have with something else. So for instance, well, actually, let's do it here. Right. From a network perspective, now these and these units, they actually should have exactly the same properties because they have the same relative position to the rest of the network. That is, they act as a connection between two other nodes. On the contrary, right, if we have two otherwise very similar, maybe identical units, and what we have here, right, we're interested in this, and what we have here is, right, these two units will have, for the purposes of our analysis, right, very different properties from each other because they have a very different role in the network, right? One is a central hub, the other is a peripheral node. Then I was having fun doing that on my whiteboard, but right? Okay, so the idea is that we move from what properties does this individual have to what position does it occupy in the network, right? In a sense, the nodes, whatever is inside these circles, doesn't really matter. What matters are the connections, the edges. Again, we're all sensible people. We know that there are things inside the nodes that will make a difference, but we're just trying to show what the approach does. It pushes a certain position to an extreme. We see how far we can go, and then in any meaningful real project, we combine it with the perspectives, right? For instance, in this case that I showed you, it's the centrality. How central is the node that we are analyzing in the network that's around it? Or we could also look not just at the individual, so we don't care about, you know, your individual properties as students of cognitive science. We care about the structure of the network that you that you develop over the years, and compare it with the kind of network that different years developed. And it's the properties of the network, the properties of your connections to each other, whether you have a bunch of cliques that are very separated from each other, whether you are very strongly cohesive, whether you have, you know, a matrix network with everybody is friend with three other people, but there is no real central network, and so on and so forth, will determine a lot of important phenomena that we're interested in, like dropout rates, right? Like your ability to go through difficult exam periods, like the ability of the class, of the learning to, sorry, the ability of the students to learn during study from home COVID period might actually depend strongly by the kind of relationships that are created. And so the network defines the information flow, if we want to think it in terms of cognition as information processing, right? And therefore, the kind of cognition, the kind of cognitive processes that are possible for the single nodes. So what does this mean in practice, right? It's all nice with fancy words, but for instance, it means that the people you know and how they're positioned in the social network will make a difference in the new people that you'll meet, for instance, for romantic purposes, right? And how you will be perceived by the new people that you meet, right? The people who introduced you to them will shine a light on you, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of studies from the 70s onward in sociology that shows that the way that people find a job and other opportunities, since we talked about science of science, collaborations, grants, as students' knowledge of cool activities to do, don't depend by your position in the network, and in particular by what is called the weak ties. Strong ties are the direct connections that you have with somebody, your friends. The weak ties are the friends of friends. Right? I can remember, I would make up a bullshit number, but there is a non-trivial proportion of jobs that are found through acquaintances of acquaintances, right? Your extended network. Also, right, as a scientist, the idea, or a student, the ideas that you get exposed to and your ability to act on them, right? It's not just that the information flows differently according to the network, is that actually your position in the network changes what you can do with that information, right? So if you get, I just heard this thing about this new idea that would be super cool, right? And you are well positioned to talk to a lot of people, it's easier to find somebody else who will help you do that. Same for papers, right? The impact and importance of a paper at equal level of quality will actually strongly be determined by who are the authors and who they co-author with, how well they are positioned in terms of funding agencies, university, media connections, which conferences they attend. There's some really cool economic paper showing the impact of attending conferences in person versus attending conference in virtual ways on how much the papers that are presented get cited and used in future research. The original PageRank algorithm that launched Google, is that too old for you, or did you hear about PageRank? Right, so the basic idea that make them different from Yahoo and AltaVista in the good old Wild West of the net in the 90s was that Google wasn't just trying to organize pages according to their content, but was actually trying to organize them according to their rank. And the rank was determined by how many links connected to that page and how many links connected to the pages that connected to your page, right? So if you're linked to by Politiken, right, that matters for much more than if your homepage is linked to by some other kid at the high school, right? And that's really debate. Then there's some interesting math in how do you determine this. There's some recursion in the calculation, which makes for a very cool problem. But that's really the idea of Google, right? That's what made the fortune of Google, the PageRank algorithm. Since you're just fresh from a neuroimaging, very intense activity last week, right? There's a lot of work in terms that it's not as interesting which area lights up differentially in the task that you're giving to your participants. What is interesting is which other areas it co-activates with, and which other areas precedes or follows the activation. That's the last I've read of Networks of the Brain. That's a book from, I think, 2010 around, but there's lots of new work on that as well. So how does this idea fit what we've been covering so far? We have seen it mentions of network-like thinking, sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit, right? In the very first lecture, the idea that your conversational performance depends on interpersonal features. That, for instance, there are some interesting ideas on styles of conversations and expectations that depends on neurotypes, meaning that you being a good conversationalist depend on whether you're interacting with somebody that matches your expectation. In that case, right, within versus between neurotype. We've seen that your team performance does not depend on the single individual, but on the relative diversity and similarities within the group. We've seen that citations and collaborations can be represented in terms of networks, and that their impact, or the impact of papers and actors, scientists, will depend on their position in the network. And again, that scientific performance is affected by diversity. If you've read the exam paper for one of the exam papers for the Science of Science lecture, you'll see that Miguel and Victor try to replicate the study by Devezer about diversity of styles in doing research, which in the Devezer paper is crucial to get to the true model of the word and stay there, not drift away. And they showed that you can have agents that are exactly the same kind of researchers throughout the whole network, but you can ensure enough diversity by creating a small word that is a network that's not completely connected, but organized in small islands, which have the occasional connections with each other. That enable scientists to only work within their connections, explore different possibilities, and not get stuck in the local minimum that somebody found early on. Also, a very cool paper that's very relevant for next week by Smaldino and O'Connor that shows that interdisciplinarity can aid the spread of better methods. That is that creating collaborations between these clusters allows for the spread of better methods that are not hindered by that's the way we've always done things. When I started doing statistics, everybody wanted you to report ANOVAs because everybody knew that ANOVAs were the way of doing things, even if they're stupid. Right? Don't do ANOVAs. Don't let your friends do ANOVAs. Okay. This is not just, right, a new thing that we can analyze, I don't know, papers and get yet another predictor of their impact. Right? These can actually change quite drastically the way we think about specific phenomena that are quite relevant to us as human beings, as cognitive scientists. So, for instance, the animal social networks. The way there's a million examples in that fantastic books about that we shouldn't just think of, for instance, comparative cognition, that is comparisons of cognition between species in terms of pure information processing power, but also in terms of how these processing gets distributed within a network, a social network. And that changes a lot of the questions that ethologists and biologists are asking, like, do individual features predict success better than network features? But more interestingly, how do individual features interact with network features, right? Let's say that we're really interested in how we can facilitate the formation of good social networks in CogSci classrooms, right? Because that really helps your quality of life. And from our perspectives, you don't drop out and we don't get the fee from the ministry, right? So we probably have some individual features that are important for establishing new connections. There's probably some random features which are just who do you sit close by when at the intro week, right? There's this fantastic study in which they, how did it do? It was in the States. They actually had, I think it was a personality questionnaire, and then they had some classes in which they decided at random who would sit close to who. And then they showed that 20 years later, who people sat close by the first day of university had actually a quite strong impact on the probability of still being friends. Right. Another thing that's very near and dear to me is that it actually changes quite drastically the way we think about mental disorders. In which ways? Well, some analyses that are referred there have started looking at the symptoms that are used to diagnose a mental disorder. For instance, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, general anxiety, etc., etc. And they looked at how similar the profile of diagnosis is to the profile of another diagnosis, showing that in truth, right, you actually have a lot of overlap. That is, that most of the symptoms are not specific to one diagnosis, but they're shared across a broad spectrum of diagnosis of conditions. They also show, and I think that's even more cool, that the traditional medical perspective on a mental disorder is that you have an underlying cause, genetic mutation, childhood trauma, environmental exposure, what have you, which generates a cluster of symptoms that justifies the fact that you have diagnosis, which, for instance, in the ICD, that's the system we use in Denmark, are hierarchical, meaning that as soon as you have a diagnosis like schizophrenia, which is a broad spectrum of symptoms, it's really hard to get a different diagnosis because that suppose that you have this sort of underlying cause, which we really don't know what it is, but it's going to cause a lot of deviant or atypical presentations, right? Symptoms, behaviors, clinical and cognitive features, and so on and so forth. However, once we start looking at the symptoms and their positions as a network, right, we can start seeing that there are interesting feedback loops which do not need to have a strong explanation in an underlying biological cause, and two, they actually can explain the fact that there is a huge amount of comorbidity between diagnoses. What is comorbidity is the fact that, for instance, if you have autism, there's a 50% probability you also have ADHD, right? That if you have depression, there is quite a strong probability that you'll also develop general anxiety, and so on and so forth. And the idea is that these symptoms might actually have, we might look at the way that the information flows between symptoms, the way they appear within individuals and in the populations, and see that there are kind of active roles on the surface instead of on the latent variable. Let's make an example, right? So I get stressed about an exam, right? Which means that I have a hard time falling asleep, which means that my cognitive function gets impaired, which means that I don't achieve as much as I wanted in my preparation for the exam, which means that I lose even more sleep, right? Which means that I can develop anxiety, right? Which means that I might fail the exam, which means that I can develop depression, right? And so on and so forth. So you see that even if maybe you don't have like an underlying strong cause of anxiety, that might be generated by these sort of feedback loops between the symptoms. So Here I made not true, inspired by papers, but not true networks of symptoms of depression. And I want you to take 2 minutes with your peer to look at it and think, if you were a therapist, and this is a very thought experiment, you're not therapists, right? If you were a therapist, which node or nodes do you think that it would be promising to act upon? The arrows that you see are to be assumed as causal relations. That is, that if you start manifesting a certain symptoms and that symptom points to other symptoms, they will also have a high likelihood to develop, and so on and so forth. So 2 minutes to do that. Okay, so what do you think? Yes. Yeah, it's not necessarily what causes everything else, but it's in a symptom that has a lot of impact on other symptoms. Yes. Good. Are there other candidates for intervention? Right? It's tricky, right? Because you could say, well, concentration problems. Well, we have central nervous system stimulants, amphetamines that we can give to people, right? Uh, so that would be easy to intervene, right? But of course, right, it's taken into a network. We have SSRIs, antidepressants, they work. That's too simplistic, but for the reduction that we're doing now, they work on the depressed mood, but they might not be able to affect everything else, right? Of course, this is a made-up network. There's lots of feedback loops in the network that make this approach challenging, right? But this was just to showcase the idea. Yes.
Would you advocate that, like a solution, for example, say working out with that benefit for several of them?
Yes.
Each other, or would it be like having a lot of connections, like a hub, having a lot of individual teams?
So your question is whether that would have an impact on how we think of the network, or are you asking?
The actual causal relationship.
Yeah, I think that's up for research, right? But things are complicated. So I've really liked this approach. I've also my partner started treating people with ADHD as part of her clinical work. And one of the things that you see in ADHD is that you have symptoms like emotion dysregulation. It's hard to sort of keep your emotions in check. You have concentration problems, you have insomnia. And for at least a subpart of the patients, the drug, the amphetamines, right, hit most of them at the same time, right? So things are complicated, but you can very quickly see that at least for these liminarly pathological, not a clinical depression, but a light depression, these kind of feedback loops might actually be very effective to design interventions like working out, right? And then we have to figure out how they work. There's a fantastic project by Eiko Fried in Leiden in the Netherlands, who is working on 2,000 university students trying to map liminally pathological symptoms of anxiety and depression and applying exactly this kind of math ideas and methods like working out, like therapy, like just peer groups and so on and so forth to see how we can actually improve at least these less severe cases of mental conditions. Yeah. Another example where this can be used is to intervene on misinformation or on vaccinations, right? So look at these two different networks. Imagine that there's a terrible disease that is looming, let's say wanting to study cognitive science, right? And you need to go and intervene, but you don't have the resources to send a serious clinical psychologist to talk with everybody in the network and persuade them that that's a terrible idea, right? So you want to really hit certain nodes that will stop the propagation of this disease, right? They're a bit different structures, so have a look, 2 minutes, and then we'll discuss how it works. Okay, I'll add a second question and then I'll let you finish discuss. That is, now you probably have some ideas given that you know the structure of the network, but you're going to intervene in all high school in Denmark to stop them from applying to cognitive science, and you don't know the network within those schools, and you don't have the resources to map it in advance. So try to think if you have a good heuristic that would allow you to identify who to target. And this is something that's very relevant. For instance, it's been used at the very least to, for instance, target with specific information groups of people that for privacy issues do not want to disclose their network. For instance, sex workers related to specific sexual diseases, illegal immigrants, criminals of different sorts that for public health reasons or human reasons you actually want to target in your intervention, right? So think about not only once you know the network, who you should target, but if you don't know the network, what should you do? Okay, so let's say we know the network, and let's take the network on the left, right? Who would you contact? Well, Valeria. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So you would look at centrality in the network, and then you would target starting from the most central and then going lower. Other ideas in that? Good. That's a good strategy. And indeed, the person J and then person D and person R are the ones that would actually maximize your impact. In the second network on your right, would the same strategy work? Yes. Exactly. Perfect. So there's two clusters or two communities according to the jargon you want to use. And it's not just spreading this terrible disorder of wanting to study cognitive science inside the cluster, which is an issue, but also the connections between clusters. Because if you can isolate the clusters, let's say with vaccinations, that means that there's going to be a much lower chance that the disease can spread across communities. If you think COVID, right, you want to vaccinate first the people who actually have to cross different communities like clinical workers, like people working at Nimley and carrying all the groceries in different places, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, now we don't know um, the network. How do we go at finding the good people to target? Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. But that's still, so let's say that you actually can access through this way the sex workers, but you only have a new HIV vaccine for 10 people, right? How do you find those 10 people? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, that's a good idea. It's sort of cheating a bit because we want to think networks, right? We don't want to think about the single individual property. But you're right. So if we look at the distribution of properties, then we could get at some prototypical person. That's absolutely a good idea. Let's though just look at networks and connections, right? So a really clever idea that's used in epidemiology and in public health work is that we know that we want to target the most central networks. The property of the most central networks is that most networks are connected to them, compared to the least central networks for which most nodes are not connected to them, right? Therefore, if we take some of those people at random, right, in the hubs that you're talking about, and we ask them to refer us to somebody in the trade or to somebody of their friends at the high school and so on and so forth, they're much more likely to point us to a central node than to point us to a less central node. Right? So just by randomly sampling and asking for a connection, we can get pretty effectively to the central nodes. And you can demonstrate that with a simulation. I haven't run it, but you can do it, right? Which is kind of cool, right? These ideas of network properties gives you a very powerful and efficient tool to intervene. There is indeed a lot of work that tries to map real networks in epidemics. And I know these networks are actually pretty famous. Do you know those? So the one on the left is the network that presumably maps the first spread of HIV in the United States, starting from a flight attendant, presumably. The one on the right is the network that presumably started COVID, right? And we study them because social phenomena tend to change all the time. So we need to know which kind of networks underlie the spread of different kind of phenomena in different societies as societies are changing. So we can get more effective tools to target whatever we want to target. If you want more fun, I put there a link of a very difficult online simulation that gives you different social structure, and you need to vaccine only 6 people in those structures. And then it tells you how many people got sick, which is pretty fun. My youngest is homesick today, so he had the joy of having to beta test all these lecture with me. And he thought that it was so frustrating to have to play that thing. These you probably know, but Pandemic is also a very cool way of putting these network ideas into practice. Okay, so it's now 3, so it's perfectly time to move to a pause, and then we will start actually looking at the math and how do we make concrete networks out of our data. Okay, so far we dealt with the more conceptual aspect. Now, what we want to do is to go a bit more into the nitty-gritty details of what networks are and how we build them and analyze them so that you're going to be extra ready for Friday and for using these tools. So, what is a network? And I'll put Marcus away. Oh, yes, of course. Yes. What is a network? A graph or network, according to whether you speak to mathematicians who like graphs or computer scientists who like networks, is a mathematical set composed of 2 other sets. A set of nodes or vertices and a set of edges or arcs. They're the same thing, just different disciplines. Like this. You have a bunch of nodes and you have some connections between them. They're usually represented as an adjacency matrix where nodes are plotted against each other, right? So where did I put it, right? You have Node 1, node 2, node 3, node 4, node 5, node 1, node 2, node 3 or 4, node 5. And then you go and check, right? Is one connected? Well, of course, the center is kind of moot, but is one connected to 2? Yes, you put a 1. Is one connected to 3? No, you put a 0. Right? That's really what that is. Or it could be represented as an edge list where L0 is a list of the nodes that are connected to node 0, thus representing the edges. In R, usually, since we like our data frames, we tend not to do lists of that sort, but we do a data frame with a column called from and a column called to, and then you have 1 to 2, but you don't have from 1 to 3 as a row. Here is the example of how this network up there would be represented in terms of adjacency metrics and how it would be represented in terms of an edge list. You'll see examples of these on Friday, where you'll be given old CogSci classes and the social networks inside those classes. There's several types of graphs. There's directed graphs, meaning graphs in which the connection has a clear direction to from. For instance, since I'm old, in the old days of Twitter, right, you could follow somebody without them following you, compared to Facebook, where if you're friend with somebody, you're both friends with each other, right? It needs to be directed. In real life, if you consider somebody a friend, they don't necessarily consider you a friend. So it's directed as well. If you're married, at least for the time you're married, that's supposed to be undirected, though it's new days, so who knows, right? Also, the networks can be weighted or unweighted. This means that the connections can be binary. Either there is a connection or there's no connection, or they can have an intensity, right? For instance, in some of the networks that we've seen before, the intensity or weight of a connection was given by how many contacts per day or per week you would have with a person, right? Which would affect the probability of transmitting information or an infection, or both, right? So weighted, you have numbers that define the strength of the connection. Unweighted, you have 0 and 1s. This is how the data is going to look like. This goes away. Right? You have a bunch of pseudonymized names, and pseudonymized means that at least up to a certain point, we had a key where we had the true name of the individual, and then which pseudonym it would correspond to. At this point, they've become anonymized because we had to delete the keys. Where you have that EZ, whatever, that person there is connected to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different people, and they report the intensity of their friendship in terms of numbers, right? So they're really good friends with the second and the third. They're not very good friends with the number 5, right? Does this structure make sense? Yes. Yeah, so Cristiano will go through a bit of the details, but the data that you're going to be playing with, there were an attempt that we did for a few years to track the social networks as they develop in the class. And we had several questions that we asked. One was, list your friends. Right? Another was, if you're organizing a party, who do you make sure to invite? Another would be, if you're struggling with your code for methods 1, right? who would you ask for help? Because social networks often are conceived as one thing, but actually there's many, many layers in social networks according to the activities that we do, right? Are these data directed or undirected? Yes. Yes, exactly. We're asking people, and they are telling us, these are my friends. There is no check that those people also list them as their friends, which is the reason we never have data from one class analyzed within that class. Is the data weighted or unweighted? Yes? Yes. Yes, it is weighted. We could make it unweighted just by saying, as long as you name somebody, they are your friend. But the way that's been coded, it's weighted. Good. So how do we visualize this? Usually you're not gonna write the kind of stuff that I'm writing down now, but I want you to understand how do we go from that data to the network representation. Usually there's something that's called force-directed layout algorithms, right? What we do is we want a representation in which nodes that are connected are close to each other, where the links are as much as possible of the same length, and there's as few links as possible crossing each other, because if they're all overlapped, we can't see anything. It's technically called a hairball, right? So this is where I'm a nerd, because I really like going through this stuff. There is no analytical solution for high N of nodes and links. So what we do is we set up an agent-based simulation, which you learn next week. The basic idea is that we can use some mathematical knowledge of the word, in particular physics metaphors, to get a lot of the conceptual work for us. So we have nodes that are conceptualized as charged particles that repel each other. If you remember your high school physics, right? You have Coulomb law, which is basically that the repulsion between two particles with the same charge is proportional to 1 divided the square of the distance, right? The further you are from each other, the less you care about each other, right? The closer you are to each other, the more you're sort of pushing away. My two kids, right? They actually love each other at a distance. The links are springs, right? The things that are a spiral that I can't remember what they're called in Danish, but right. And there we have from high school mechanics, the Hooke law that says that the force that a spring exercises when you're trying to pull it apart is equal to K, which is a constant given by the material and the thickness of the spring, times X, which is the distance. I should have written it as D, sorry. So meaning that the more you're pulling it apart, the more it's trying to get back. In real life, at a certain point, it breaks. In this world, no, it actually really gets back together, right? Like quarks. The more you pull apart quarks in the real world, the more they just slap against each other again. So what we can do is we can build up a very simple simulation with those very simple equations, start with the nodes placed at random, apply the equation, adjust their position. Now, of course, the landscape of forces in which they are has changed. So we need to reapply the equation, adjust their position until they more or less get into a decent visualization. Then, since we've been doing that for 40 years now, we can add some fancy stuff. So, for instance, random perturbation, so that they don't just get into a bad place by chance and get stuck there. We can use annealing, which is another nice physics metaphor, where at the beginning you have a lot of energy in the system, a lot of random perturbations. But as the system stabilizes, it gets less and less noise, less and less energy in the system, less and less temperature. And then I built these representation of the simulation, right? And this is with temperature, so the perturbation that keeps being the same over time. And this one instead has temperature that is high at the beginning, and then it decreases over time, so they tend to not be pushed away from their space. Right, so you see lots of movements at the beginning, and then it gets more and more stable, right? It's never completely stable because a system with a lot of nodes is not really a stable system. Have you seen the three-body problem? Right. So three, when you're trying, well, they're using that only tangentially, but when you have three bodies in the system, it's very hard to create a stable system that doesn't pull apart. Right. Okay, then what we want to do is we can visualize these networks, we can stare at them, we can chat with our friends about them and confabulate all sort of fancy patterns, but we also need to put some numbers on these fancy patterns. And that's actually what we're going to do through the rest of the lecture. That is, I'm going to explain some things, I'm going to show you some networks, I'm going to ask you how you would quantify their difference, and then we'll see which kind of standard solution have been developed. So we want to look at these networks, try to get a grasp of how they look like. Usually we have a domain and the problem we're trying to solve, so we have extra knowledge. We want to be critical and try to figure out, given the problem at hand and the structure of these networks, what would be a metric that makes sense? Because often people just have a bunch of functions from iGraph or whatever other package you use, and then they just apply them a bit at random. But we want to actually think through. So for instance, if we think that learning in a class is mediated by the network, we might want to know how connected each student is, right? We want to know how connected on average the class is, but also what's the percentage of students with low connections? Because if we're interested in your learning, right, we want to make sure that the connections, the information flows, right? So for instance, we could not just say how many connections you have, but we can identify the central students in terms of who you ask for help with methods 1, or in your case, methods 4. And we would then measure the average distance that each student has from the central students. Right? So here I generated two networks. They have exactly the same amount of nodes, 50 nodes, and they have 200 links. I want you to think for a minute on what the difference is between those two networks and how you would go at quantifying it. It's not trivial, right? We're trying to train our brain at working with this kind of data. Okay. So let's talk about some different. Is there any meaningful difference between those two networks? Something that you think could be interesting? Yes? Okay, so what you're saying is that, yes, I'm going to say left, uh, a few low connected. Connected, and then you say on the right, we have at least two, well, yes, yeah, at least two connections. Okay, yes, something else? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'd say there's a bigger inequality in connections on the right than on the left. In connections. Yes. Somebody else? Okay. How would we go at quantifying this? Yes?
Good. That you would maybe do something with exponentially value each of the networks so that nodes with a lot of connections will have a stronger impact on the score.
Mm-hmm.
Nodes with less connecting.
Yes. So, well, I think you're getting there, not completely. Let me see if I understood what you're saying. So the first thing is say we count connections. Uh, connection by node. Right. And that's gonna have a certain distribution on the left and a certain distribution on the right. And then you're saying that we might do exponentiation or a log of that, or
Yeah,
okay, because
that would take into account if you just take the average, then the thing that doesn't take into account that some will be hubs having a lot of impact.
mm-hmm.
And like the spread of the variation.
So what I would do is I would look at the distribution first, right? And then you're right. So if we look at the average, here it's going to be representative, but here it's not going to be very representative because the long tail is affecting the distribution or the estimation of the mean. So let me see. I think I put some stuff here. The first measure is, you're exactly right, is the degree to which the nodes are connected. Some people look at the total edges of a network. In our case, I simulated the network so that it would be exactly the same. Some people look at average degree, which is the total edges divided the total nodes. How many edges does a node participate to on average? And that has some value, but as you were saying, right, it doesn't really work well in a network in which there is high inequality of connections. And so people have also been looking at the degree distribution. So let's look in that in those two networks. We have on the top row the left network, on the bottom row the right network. We see that the average degree is exactly the same between the two, but the minimum degree is 0 on the left plot, and 2 on the right plot. And the maximum degree is 11 on the left plot and 14 on the left plot, on the right plot. And we can plot the distribution, and you can see that even if with these relatively few nodes and possibilities for connection, there's a lot of overlapping, the shape is quite clearly different. The red one, the right network, is a log normal distribution, and the other one is closer to a normal distribution. So we could do a log transformation and then take the rate of the exponential as our measure of the different distributions. I think I can skip that. So now we have 2 different networks again. Again, they have the same amount of nodes and the same amount of connections. And I want you to think a minute and chat with your mate about what are the differences between these 2 networks and how you would go at quantifying them. Okay. So any taker? Yes. Yes. Expand. Yeah. Good. How do you measure clusters? Mm-hmm. Yes. So we'll see that there's at least a couple of methods to do that, and I'll have them in a couple of slides. Yes.
Would you be able to do this once you find that when other points are close to this, but then you go to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to the furthest one and down the left side that doesn't have any other points in that contains like the cluster for itself, then you begin at some other point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what would you get out of that?
Then you get the amount of cluster.
Yeah. So something like k-mean clustering. Yes. Oops. Yeah. Is there something else? So this was an interesting simulation for me because actually I started with something slightly different. So I wanted to look at connectivity. the fractions of the neighbors to a node that are also neighbors to each other, meaning it's called also the triadic closure, right? You're here, you have two friends. How many of the pairs of your friends would also list each other as friends? Right? And I wanted the um, the two networks to have the same amount of connections, the same amount of nodes, but just a difference in global clustering coefficients. And the interesting stuff is that that generated automatically a bunch of clusters. But what we can see is that on the left, we have that the global clustering coefficient is much higher than the one on the right, meaning that a lot more triads are closed compared to the right. Yes, compare to what happens on the right. And that's because I kept the number of connection constants. So if you're closing the triads, there's less connections to go around. So if you have very tightly knitted groups of friends, they also won't have as much time to go around and have other friends, which is not true, but it's to qualitatively understand what's going on here. Yes, I think there's two more. So these ones, right? Let's look at these two networks and again, they have the same amount of connections, the same amount of nodes. What is that characterizes their difference? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. So the idea is that the way that information can flow in these two networks is very different. On the left, even if the connections are somewhat sparse, right, you can start from, you can reach, so if you can start from one node and reach another node in a few different ways. And the distance is x. On the right hand, we have that really it's more like the Chilean road system, right? Which just goes straight from the north to the south with not much redundancy. It's one road, which means that you can very easily organize road blocks, or you can have very easily an issue. And as soon as something happens anywhere in the road, you cannot reach any other place anymore, right? And here, what I asked the simulation to optimize was the average path length. So given two nodes, what's the average distance that the average number of nodes that you would need to cross in order to get from the one to the other? And so on the left, we have that the average path length is 5.17, and the diameter that is the longest path between two, the longest shortest path between two nodes is 12, while on the right, the average path length is almost 9, and the diameter that is the two nodes for which the shorter distance is highest is 25, right? Meaning that if we take the two extreme nodes, the shortest path between them is 25, and that's the longest amongst all possible shortest path between two other nodes. Good. This is the last example that I want you to deal with. And I think you probably have some ideas, but what do you think this is about? How do these two networks differ? Yes? Yes, this is another case in which I started with something else, and then I ran the simulation 100 times, and it kept giving me these kind of results. And my kid was very thrilled that he was at home sick while I was running this stuff. So the idea is that we have clusters on the left, and we have just one macro component on the right. That's very obvious. But also, as you were noting, the number of connections that the central nodes are getting is very different in the two cases. In the left, right, the nodes are on average more equally connected to each other, while on the right, you have a few very central nodes and a bunch of peripheral nodes. So what we can do is here, I can just represent the adjacency metrics, right? Instead of ones and zeros, I just put a dot. And what we see that on the have I give me a second. I think I've inverted those two. Sorry. These are the one that's on the left is the one on the right, and vice versa. I corrected. We can see that in the adjacency matrix, we see some clear clusters here on the right, which was the left, and some diffuse connectivity here on the left, which was the right. And the way that we can measure this is the betweenness centrality. That is, if we want to measure how modular the network is, we need to check how many times is a node mediating between two any other nodes, right? How many times, if you have the shortest path between all possible pairs of nodes, excluding the one I'm interested in, does the shortest path passes through there, right? So how many times this person is really the bridge between two other people? And what we have is that on the network on the left, right, didn't I write it? I didn't write it. But the centrality is, the betweenness centrality is much lower than the one on the right, because there being clusters, none of the shortest path in the yellow and in the purple will pass through a blue node. While on the right, there are a lot of nodes that are really central to all of the connections. Good. This brings us to the last useful tool that I want you to have sort of a grasp of. That's the community detection, where a community or a cluster is defined as a group of nodes where each node is more connected to nodes within the group than to nodes outside the group. And just like the page ranking, this definition should push you to think that probably there is no analytic solution and we need to simulate stuff, because it's kind of circular. So let's see how we can investigate that. We build a network, and the way I built the network was I used the stochastic block model construction, which takes a predefined number of nodes and communities. I gave it 60 nodes and 6 distinct communities. I gave it a community structure. I told that each community contains 10 nodes, right? So basically I went through the first 10 and I said your community 1, the second 10, your community 2, etc., etc. And then I generate edges between any possible pair of nodes according to a connection probability matrix. It's a fancy word to say that I say if you're a member of the same community, there is a high probability that there is an edge between your two nodes. 0.6 or 0.75, I just randomly picked between those, so the communities would look a little different. But if two nodes are not part of the same community, I give it a very low probability of there being a connection, 0.05. Why am I going through this? Because actually being able to generate networks is very important for null models in the stuff that we will do probably later in the course. So this is the kind of network that I generated in one of the simulations. Right? You can see very clearly coded by color the 6 different clusters, the 6 different communities. They're not completely isolated, as in some of the examples that I was showing you, which makes the problem more interesting, right? Because when we have real data, that's usually the kind of structure we see, and we need to infer whether there are these communities or not. So a common way of looking at that is to use what is called the Girvan-Newman algorithm, which uses edges betweenness. That is, the core idea is that the method notices that communities are separated by bridge edges, right? So in other words, if I randomly remove some node and suddenly two nodes are not more connected with each other, they're probably part of two different communities, because if they were part of the same community, there would always be another path between them, right? So what we can calculate is the edge betweenness of all the edges. Then we can rank them, the edges that are most often on the shortest path between any two given nodes. We can remove those edges, right? And then recalculate. And we do that until we create clusters that have no connection with each other. Technically, we measure the modularity using that formula, which we don't care about now because it's run by the functions that you can use in the packages until it stabilizes. And so we run it on that network. And what we see is that at the beginning, there's 0 communities or 1, right? Everything is one big chunk. They're all connected with each other. We do one step, and already we are 12 communities, right? And no, sorry, not 12, 2 communities, and the modularity has risen because suddenly the network is not completely connected. And then we do it again, and we can see that the number of communities rises and rises and rises until it finds 12 communities. I ran these a bunch of times. It still stabilizes between 8 and 12 communities, this algorithm. So if we compare, what we see is that some of the nodes that would be part of the same communities are identified as separate communities because this is a small network and some of the nodes are sparsely connected. So it doesn't take much to isolate them. So what I did is I went and looked at what the other dominant algorithm, that's the Leuven method, would do, which starts on the opposite side. The previous one took the whole network as one community and then started removing some edges and see how it would create communities. Here it does the opposite. It says every single node is its own community. And then what we can do is we can move at random the nodes into other communities and then see whether the modularity increases. And then we repeat. And what we can see is that, don't I have, I didn't put the other one. Sorry, I forgot. That happens when I'm holding a kid's hat over the toilet while trying to run the simulation. To keep the kid out of the toilet, not to push him in the... And what we can see is that by doing that, actually, we get exactly the kind of communities that we had coded in. Again, I'm a fan of doing any sort of quantitative research by simulation, meaning that you need to understand what your methods are doing. So if you ever end up working on network, remember to simulate and see what the different methods are doing in situations you know the truth. But there's a bunch of additional methods to detect communities. There's a couple of links there on other ways. Another is a random walk, where you parachute agents on the network in random nodes. You make them move according to the strength of the connection around them. So if there's a connection that's 6 and a connection that's 1, you're going to have 6 to 1 probabilities of moving to the strong one, and 1 out of 6 on 6 to go on the other. And then you trace their path, and then you see whether it comes back. Right? But yes, there's a bunch of stuff that you can look more into. One thing that, though, I want to emphasize is that a big plague in network studies is that summary statistics are very informative. As we've seen, they capture often our intuition. We can use them in a meaningful way to answer the questions that we have, but they're also very fragile. Because, what does it mean that a network has a clustering coefficient of 3.25 and another of 5? Or even, right, that a network has a 3 clusters and the other has 4 clusters, right? What is the practical implications of this, right? Is one bad? Is one good, right? But also, right, now we have a number. These class of cogsi had 3 clusters instead of 4. This must be good because there's a different thing. And that really depends on the question, right? We've seen that, for instance, in diversity in science studies, having clusters is a good way of ensuring that not everybody gets flattened in the same model. Just like having a public discussion in class is usually less productive than first letting you get an informed opinion by discussing with a peer and then coming into the plenum, right? But also, as a statistics nerd, right, fragile, because these are just numbers, right? There's a lot of noise in which nodes are there and which nodes are connected to each other. When I ask you who are your friends, if you just happen to bike along the way with one of your mates who is on the border between being a friend and just being somebody in the class, that will probably push that person up, right? So there's different ways of dealing with that. For instance, you can have many networks. Sometimes when you have cog-sci students, right, we only have that many cohort that we're running. There's bootstrapping, which is the poor person's Bayes, because Bayes is the true way, the gospel and the light. But you can also, as you're taking methods 4, consider that really estimating the connection between 2 nodes is a Bayesian inference problem with uncertainty and so on and so forth. And the inimitable McHarith has, of course, a lecture on that in his course on methods 4, which is linked there, and a paper on that. And then there's another really cool paper that in Python tries to build a general way of estimating networks in a Bayesian fashion and communities in a Bayesian fashion. Okay, I'm out of time, so I'm just going to rush through this. We can use networks to visualize and analyze data. This was the work that Pernille and Clara, 2 of the cog-sci students, did on a cog-sci cohort that arrived to 4th semester without COVID and study from home. And this was another cohort that only arrived at 4th semester through 3 semesters of COVID, right? And you can see that the structure of the network is very different. I linked their paper in the exam papers. Those are actually the study groups, except for Pernille, Clara, and another person that now I can't remember, who were so central that they didn't get clustered with their study groups. We're not going to go with this. This is actually, I had a student who did a really cool work on representing football data using networks. We can use networks to design experiments. For instance, here are two different kinds of papers where we design the network and then allow people to interact only with those that are connected to them, and that changes how information flows. We can use that to design simulations. Again, that's not very important, extra stuff. Actually, I'm doing have you been to Mullajord at Mosgård? You should go to Mosgård. It's a fantastic museum. They also have an exhibit about the Neolithic pottery in Denmark. And we're actually trying to figure out ways of assessing how different styles emerge in different areas of Denmark and periods by looking at how these elements co-occur with each other so that we can actually build networks of patterns in different pottery. And since I never have enough time to do all the cool stuff, if any of you wants to do projects on that, we can share the data, and that would be fun. Bayesian, remember. Next week, the very last thing, we're going to do agent-based models. Please prepare. I sent an email with the very minimal stuff you need to do. The lecture is given by Arthur Hjort, who's a friend of CogSci. He's at the BSS, and he's going to give you an introduction to agent-based models. He's really an expert, and he's also been developing ways of having agents embodied by language models, having conversations with each other. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be here for that because my youngest brother is finishing his PhD next Wednesday. But Christiane is going to do the introduction. And not the introduction. He's going to be the friendly face that interfaces between you and Arthur. And then on Friday, I'll be with, and we have another very talented researcher. He's a Romanovska who just got a huge European grant to use agent-based models to reconstruct social dynamics in ancient civilizations. But what she's gonna work with us on is a hands-on exercise using NetLogo, studying social dynamics in a famous cafe in Santa Fe. And there's two books, one that uses AVMs to model science. The other is a fantastic handbook that if I'm gonna teach this course again, maybe I'm actually just gonna base it on that, showing how we can model a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about using agent-based models. And with that, thank you.